everyone. This is James Lindsay. Welcome to New Discourses Bullets, where I go over a single topic in tremendous detail so that you can understand the woke movement and what it's doing, woke Marxism, and try to keep it under 10 minutes. So today we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is DEI, and the related concepts of belonging and justice. So I want to make this simple for people. What you need to know about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that equity is the goal. We'll start there. The Canadians call it EDI instead of DEI usually. They put equity first. That makes sense because equity is the goal. What is equity? Equity means socialism. Equity is a rebranding of socialism. How do you know this? What is socialism by definition? If you understand Marxist ideology, and I mean specifically Marxist socialism, if you understand Marxist ideology, you understand that Marx believed that capitalism would give into its own contradictions, then the proletariat would rise up, seize the means of production, and they would create an administered economy where they redistribute material resources, opportunity, etc., according to Marxist theory. So, in particular, people would be made equal. Shares would be adjusted so that people would be made equal. And this would be done by the proletariat. Equity is the same thing. Social equity is defined by H. George Frederickson as compared against equality as when citizens A and B are equal, and equity is when shares are adjusted so that citizens A and B are made equal. In other words, you're going to have the seizure of the means of distribution of resources, whether those are material or cultural. They're going to be redistributed to groups and then within the groups to individuals within those groups. And so you're going to have a redistributed economy where groups are made equal, and presumably most individuals within those groups will be equalized by that mechanism. So equity means socialism. The only thing that's different is it's not purely economic. It now takes into account things like racial identity, sexual identity, gender identity, fat status, and so on. All these identity politics. So if we want to be technical, equity is neo-socialism that uses neo-Marxist theory, whereas Marxist socialism uses old-school Marxist theory. Equity is the goal, to create a socialist redistribution system that's administered by people who are in the so-called capital P party. How do you get the capital P party and put it in power? That's what diversity and inclusion are for. Diversity is half of that mechanism. Diversity is not diversity meaning looking different or having different backgrounds or different, gender, sex, sexuality characteristics. What diversity means is that those characteristics are spoken to in an authentic way, which is defined by the neo-Marxist identity theories, whether that's critical race theory, gender theory, queer theory, or whatever else. So you are actually, under their view, not authentically diverse because you're not representing your diverse perspective authentically unless you're speaking to it from a position that's adopted the critical theory, the relevant critical theory. We see in policy documents all over that diversity doesn't mean hiring for characteristics like sex, gender, race, etc. It means hiring for expertise in diversity. And if people happen to be of different sex, gender, etc., that's even better. Expertise in diversity means you've adopted the so-called unique, structurally determined voice of color or voice of your identity. And therefore, you are actually speaking what the critical theory or the Marxist theory, Marxist identity theory, is saying that somebody who looks like you should be saying. So this is the installation of political officers. To really kind of dig into this, even though this is kept short, the key thing you have to understand is this idea of structural determinism. For the woke Marxist ideology, there are all of these power dynamics like systemic racism, systemic sexism, misogyny, cis-heteronormativity, transphobia, all of these things, and they're systems. And those systems actually condition people. They limit the range of how they can understand the world, understand themselves, and their place in it. And so certain people who have adopted the identity Marxist theory are considered awakened or conscious, critically conscious, race conscious, gender conscious. And what that means is that they understand that you have to understand your race, your sex, your gender, your identity, your class status, whatever it is, in terms of the Marxist analysis of it. Those people are said to understand the authentic voice that describes what that condition is, the so-called true nature of their lived experience or lived realities, that has been structurally determined by the forces of society conditioning the full range of who they can be. Thus, you're only diverse if you are speaking the critical Marxist view of what it means to be a person who looks like you or has certain characteristics that you have. So in other words, you have to have identity politics that are identical, just changing depending on what identity you happen to be speaking from to count as diverse. And if to become a diversity officer, you have to be an expert in this. In other words, you have to be fully trained and qualified to think and speak in this way, and then to enforce this line of thought on everybody else because you've mastered the theory that you can then confuse everybody with. So the goal is equity, which is socialism. It will be achieved by installing political officers under a banner of diversity because the only people who count as diverse are the people who install the politics. Inclusion is censorship and purges, which is the other half of installing a political party. And I mean capital P party. How does it work? Under these doctrines of systemic power, anybody who is offended by something that upholds the existing systemic power gets to call that out, and everybody who's committing that problem has to be stopped from doing that because of the power dynamic that they're reproducing. So when you think in terms of power dynamics, inclusion means that people who are affected badly by these so-called power dynamics have to be made to be included. Everybody else is believed to be automatically included. So ideas that might offend somebody who is in a so-called protected class must be excluded to promote an inclusive environment. Pictures, images, rocks, anything in the world that might make somebody feel like they can associate through, whatever. Master bedrooms, for example, give people the idea of slavery, even though they have nothing to do with slavery. The term was invented in the 1920s in a catalog, a marketing catalog. And so anything that can give somebody the idea of something that feels like power dynamics has to be censored. So inclusion requires censorship. But anybody who's ever brought these ideas up, somebody who has done something racially insensitive or something in the past, might remind somebody of that power dynamic or uphold that power dynamic by their mere presence. So they have to be removed. So that's purges. And in fact, it can be done proactively or just based on identity. The mere sight of a white person, for example, or a straight person in a space might remind somebody of the white supremacy and its inescapability according to critical race theory's race Marxism. And thus, they have to be removed. And that's why you see segregated spaces being promoted as desegregation and inclusive environments. So inclusion means censorship and purges, which means that the party ideology and the party apparatchiks get to have all of the say and get to have all of the positions. So just to touch quickly, that's DEI. It is the installation of communist political officers for the goal of establishing socialism under a neo-Marxist identity politics mechanism. The two related ideas that I'll touch on very quickly are belonging. Sometimes you'll see a B stuck in there for belonging, DEI-B, and then justice, and sometimes they'll even spell that Jedi, J-E-D-I. Just to touch on those briefly, belonging is inclusion plus positive affirmation plus celebration. And so that means it's not just enough not to offend somebody that's in one of these so-called oppressed classes by the Marxist theory. You must positively affirm their presence, which means if they give you a bad idea, you have to pretend it's a good idea. Taken to its logical conclusion, we've seen this play out on the stage before. When Lenin or Stalin got up to speak and people would stand up and clap, and 10 minutes later they're still clapping. Finally, somebody would stop clapping and that person would be dragged off to prison or shot. That was belonging taken to its long-range, natural, logical conclusion. If you have to affirm the party and you have to affirm its representatives, sooner or later, more and more and more affirmation is required, and that's where you end up. So belonging is inclusion plus positive affirmation. In an engineering context, this is a disaster. Somebody detects a problem with, say, a minority's work. They say, this is wrong. That makes them feel like they don't belong as an engineer. So under belonging, you have to not correct their error. I've heard this from professional firms, and I've heard this from universities where people are not having their work corrected when it's wrong. And you can imagine what's going to happen when critical infrastructure, whether that's physical or digital, is built that way. So belonging is a disaster in the making. So when you hear somebody say, we just want to make a space where everybody feels like they belong, what that means is, according to identity Marxist theory, the people who are considered oppressed have to be positively affirmed and never treated as though they're wrong, and on top of all the inclusion requirements. Justice, by the way, is the long-range goal, where equity means socialism. In the context of social justice, in the context of the identity Marxist program, justice is communism. The quick explanation for that is Marx believed that if you install socialism and you administer this economy, eventually people won't know how to live without it. They'll see that it's perfect and beautiful. The contradictions will work themselves out through its tribulatory installation phase, and then it will become the natural way of life for the entire planet in one giant commune. And so he said socialism will eventually become communism as it becomes the logic that everybody accepts, and then the state will wither away and you'll have a utopian, stateless, classless society. Justice is the parallel concept. Social equity, enforced long enough, becomes introjected morals that people can't get away from, and eventually we arrive at things like social justice or racial justice. The best way you can tell that this is what they mean is when you actually see something like criminal justice occur, right or wrong. When Derek Chauvin is found guilty on 3 counts against George Floyd, the immediate response was, this is not justice, that was merely accountability. Accountability is a related buzzword, which means getting their way in the small scale. But in the long range, justice only emerges after equity has been enforced long enough so that it's spontaneous and just the way it is, the new hegemonic state. And so justice is the parallel concept to communism in the woke Marxist ideology. So equity is the near-term goal, justice is the long-term goal. They mean socialism and communism under neo-Marxist identity politics, respectively. Diversity is the means of installing political officers to enforce that, and inclusion and belonging are the tools by which the political officers will be concentrated, celebrated, and their opponents and dissidents will be removed, and as will disagreeing ideas and opinions.